Hello and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade American history class. Today's video lecture is on creating the American Constitution. Today's topic is on the first issue, which will be how will the people be represented in this new Constitution. The textbook readings for this particular section comes from Chapter 5, Section 3, Creating the Constitution, pages 163 to 168, and then Understanding the Constitution, which is in Chapter 6, Section 1, pages 182 to 186. Guiding questions for this video lecture: why did small populated states want equal representation in the new government? Why did large populated states want representation based on their state population? What was the Great Compromise? What was the issue surrounding slavery? And then what was the Three-Fifths Compromise? So those will be kind of the topics for today. At the Constitutional Convention, Virginian delegate James Madison shows up to the convention in Philadelphia with a plan. He was kind of a bookwormish kind of guy, loved studying, loved reading, loved history. So he read every book he could get his hands on involving government, politics, history, and philosophy. And from his research, he sort of came together a plan of what he thought would be the best option for this new form of government. His plan becomes known as the Virginia Plan because he's from the state of Virginia, where the delegation from his home state is what proposes this plan. His plan called for a new federal government that would have three parts to it: the legislative branch, which would write the laws for the new country; the executive branch, which would enforce the laws; and then the judicial branch, that would basically make sure the laws were fair and justice would be done and be equal across the entire society. So his Virginia plan was met with a lot of excitement from the delegates, but there was one potential problem that sort of came up involving the legislative branch and how the states would be represented in this new Congress. Because this new national Congress would be writing laws that would impact everybody in the country, it was really important to make sure that this was done correct. So the problem was between the small states and the big states and what they favored in terms of representation. The states with bigger population, like Virginia, wanted representation based upon their state's population. So if you look here on the graph here, states like Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia all had relatively fairly large populations in comparison to some of the other 13 states. They thought it was only fair, since they had more people living in their states and would be impacted greater by these new laws passed by this new Congress, that they should have more influence or more representation in this new Congress. So the Virginia plan, as proposed by Madison, said that the larger the state's population, the greater the representation would be in the new Congress. So the large states favored this, but the small states said, now wait a minute, time out. You're telling us then that we're going to have less say and less influence in this new national Congress. So states like Connecticut and Delaware and South Carolina and Georgia and New Jersey and New Hampshire, their populations were a little bit smaller, and they were really scared that these larger states could maybe vote them out of existence and they would have any power to stop them. So the delegation from New Jersey have their own competing plan called the New Jersey Plan that said basically that every state would get the same number of representation. So that becomes the great controversy in the convention. Now, this becomes a very hot topic, and many delegates get very upset with each other over this issue. In fact, some of the smaller state delegations even threatened to leave the convention and form alliances with our neighbors of Spain and Great Britain if they wouldn't get their way. Luckily for the delegation and for the convention and our country as a whole, Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut, has a compromise. This is sometimes known as the Connecticut Resolution or the Connecticut Plan, and more often it's referred to as the Great Compromise. What Roger Sherman said, well, now let's see if we can take a little bit of both the New Jersey Plan, which favored the small states, and the Virginia Plan that favored the larger states. So what Roger Sherman called for was, in this Great Compromise, would be to create a two-house Congress. We sometimes refer to this as a bicameral legislature. Bi meaning two. In the House of Representatives, The population of your state would determine your state's representation. So the more people living in your state, the more delegates you could send to the House of Representatives to represent your state's interests. In the Senate, this would be equal for all the 13 states. Each state would get 2 senators to represent them in the state, and at the time of the Constitution, it would be voted on by the state legislatures, not by the people living in the state. So let's look at 2 examples of how this kind of works today. Here we have 2 states side by side. We have Nebraska and California, 2 very different states. Nebraska's population in 2015 is about 1.8 million people. California's population in comparison is 38.8 million. So you can already see that California already has a much larger population. In the House of Representatives, where your state's population determines your numbers of representatives, Nebraska only gets to have 3 congressional representatives in the House of Representatives. If you look in the map down below here, you can see the 3 congressional districts of Nebraska. The 1st district, which makes up most of eastern Nebraska, the 2nd district, which makes up most of the Omaha area, and then the 3rd district, which makes out most of the rest of the western parts of the state. If you think about it, why is the 3rd district so much larger than the 2nd district? It has to do with population. The 2nd district has a lot more people living in a small area, so that's why that district in area is a lot smaller, because there's a lot of people living in the metro area. In the 3rd district, it's a lot open space, smaller towns, less people, spread out over a greater distance to get to that same number of people to be represented. And then, of course, in the Senate, Nebraska gets 2 senators because every state gets 2 senators. California's congressional map, you can see here, is broken into 53 congressional districts. And you can see in the areas that are clustered together are your large metropolitan city areas like Oakland and San Francisco, Los Angeles and San Diego. Of course, other areas of California that are in Northern California or Eastern California are less populated, so those districts are a little bit larger. And again, California gets 2 senators because that was part of the compromise. Every state gets 2 senators, and at the time the Constitution was written, those senators would be elected by the state legislatures, not directly by the people themselves. So let's break this down. The Great Compromise creates 2 parts of Congress. We call this the bicameral legislature, 2-house Congress. In the House of Representatives, the state's representation is determined by your state's population. The more people that live in your states, the more congressional districts, the more congressmen you send to Congress. In the Senate is equal. All states get 2 senators regardless of their state's size and population. And this is what makes for the Great Compromise. The second issue that we're going to be looking at under representation has to deal with the issue of slavery. So how will slaves be counted in this new Congress, this new Constitution? The issue basically boiled down into regional differences. Now, slavery existed really in all the original 13 states, but it was more common and had larger numbers of slaves in the southern states, where you had these large plantations growing crops like tobacco and rice and indigo. The North figured that slaves should not count as part of the state's population, but could be counted as property for taxing purposes. The South wanted to be able to count the slaves to basically make their numbers in their states a lot larger. We can see this played out in this graph right here. If you look at Virginia's population, that represents just the population that are not slaves, that would be the white population, it's about 400,000 people. But if we add the slave population, it almost doubles the population of Virginia, almost 700,000 people. That would double the numbers of representatives in the new House of Representatives that Virginia would be able to send. So this issue becomes a very big issue at the convention between the southern states, who wanted to count their slaves as part of their population, and the northern states that said, well, let's just count them as property. They don't have the right to vote. They can't hold offices, they can't be elected to offices, so let's count them more as property. Now, the conversation eventually reaches to a compromise between the northern and the southern states, and this becomes known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. This is a really bad compromise. What it basically says is that of every 5 states living in a slave, 3 of them would be counted as part of that state's population and also would be taxed. The owner who owned those slaves would be taxed for those 3 out of 5 slaves, hence the Three-Fifths Compromise. The delegates basically broke this up into seeing we're going to only count about 60%. That's another way to look at this in terms of percentage. So a little over half of all slaves of the state would be counted. So to see how this would play out, we can look at Virginia's population in 1790. 400,000 Virginians are non-slaves, primarily white. 300,000 are slaves, predominantly African American. So under the Three-Fifths Compromise, we can do some basic math to figure out Virginia's new population. So if we take 300,000 by 3/5 or 60%, that gives us a value of 180,000 people. So according to the Three-Fifths Compromise, of the 300,000 slaves living in Virginia, we're only going to count 3 out of 5, or 180,000 total. If I add that number to the total non-slave population, which is 400,000, it gives us a grand total of 580,000 people living in Virginia, even though the actual population of Virginia is 700,000 people. So the Three-Fifths Compromise was this compromise dealing with slavery, and it looks at counting 3 out of 5 slaves in every state for population, but also the owners of those slaves would have to claim 3 out of 5 as part of their property taxes. So the Three-Fifths Compromise isn't really used today because slavery was abolished at the end of the Civil War. But the Three-Fifths Compromise will have some big problems for our country down the road. One obvious problem is that predominantly African Americans are slaves, and we're saying they're only worth 3/5 of a person. That by itself is a really bad idea. The second problem is it puts the concept of slavery into the Constitution. Now, the language they actually used was persons in servitude, but everybody knew that meant slaves. And by putting the concept of slavery into the Constitution makes it really hard to get slavery out of it, which is what's going to eventually lead to the American Civil War, as we will be learning about later on. So that is the issues surrounding representation of the new Congress, looking at both the House of Representatives and the Senate under the Great Compromise, and of course how slaves would be counted under the Three-Fifths Compromise. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to your teacher.